Hello and welcome to Real Opinions, and today I'm going to ambitiously try to sum up my sprawling thoughts on Alex Garland's new film, Annihilation. This is, of course, Garland's follow-up to Ex Machina, which was a very popular film, despite the fact that it was essentially hard sci-fi. It wasn't a big blockbuster. It still seemed to resonate with quite a lot of people, and it definitely had a following and a big audience. Annihilation is doubling down on the confidence that I think Garland maybe acquired from that film, because it feels like he really went for it here, creating something that's a lot more ambiguous, a lot more strange, and a lot more daring, and I personally think a lot more interesting. Annihilation is certainly one of those films that it's a bit of a reviewing cliche to say it's not for everyone, but if ever there was a film that phrase was apt for, it's this one. And I don't mean this to sound patronising, but if you don't like to think, if you don't like to pay attention, if you just want to watch films for fun, which is perfectly valid, it doesn't mean that you're stupid, it just means that that's how you like to spend your time, and I totally respect that. But if you're one of those people, you don't need to watch this, you're not going to enjoy it, and you're just going to wish you got those 2 hours back. However, if you are someone who enjoys thinking, piecing things together, and kind of contemplating films after you watch them, then I thoroughly recommend Annihilation. I think that hesitancy with which I recommended it speaks volumes to what type of film this is. I think it definitely makes sense to me why Paramount got cold feet about distributing this, giving this a wide distribution. However, I would also wonder why exactly they test screened it in the first place. For those who don't know, this film has a cinematic release if you live over in the States. If you live anywhere else, it's gone straight to Netflix because Paramount did not have a lot of confidence in it. But my question would be, why was that a decision they made after making it? They showed it to test screenings, it tested poorly with audiences, and then they kind of started hedging their bets and decided, let's dump it on Netflix. Let's just dump it on Netflix and try and mitigate our losses. But why were they test screening something like this? I don't know, because it's such a weird, not mainstream friendly film. So were they expecting something else? I don't know. I find the whole thing quite confounding, because there's no way in hell that you could watch this in like a mainstream multiplex cinema with a broad, average movie-going audience and not have walkouts. In a way, I feel good that I managed to watch it on Netflix. If I lived in America and I had to see it at a cinema, I'm sure that I'd have to contend with bored, restless audiences talking, going, what? And munching on popcorn and everything. Whereas in a way, a home video, straight to streaming release makes sense, because I can just sort of sit back and absorb it at my own pace without any distractions, and that is perhaps the best way to view this film. So in a way, I think it's sad that this film is too intellectual, in quotation marks, for mainstream audiences. I think it's sad that these type of films can't get bigger releases, but at the same time, I'm can't think of a better way of watching it than alone and away from other people who will no doubt get on my nerves. Because make no mistake, this is not a film that is gonna appeal to those who want to go and turn their brains off. It is ambiguous, it is structurally, it kind of shifts time, it's pessimistic, it's at times quite gory and disgusting. It has characters and protagonists that aren't the most obviously sympathetic and rootable for. It doesn't spoon feed you with its meaning or its themes, and towards the end it gets into existential, Lovecraftian weirdness that I can just imagine, I can hear it now. Audiences going, that was a bit rubbish. That was shit. What was that all about? And if you are the type of person who enjoys thinky sci-fi, you still need to go in prepared. This isn't like Arrival or Inception or even Ex Machina. Those were admittedly films you had to pay attention to, but they were still accessible, coherent, and relatively normal. They were playing with ideas that you'd seen before. You've seen things like Arrival and you've seen things like Ex Machina before. They didn't really introduce new ideas. This does require you to pay attention. And at the same time, I think that was a good thing. It was nice to watch a film where I was like, oh, I don't remember the last time I saw something like this. There were a lot of moments and a lot of concepts here that were unfamiliar to me as an audience member, and I really appreciated and perhaps more accurately admired that about the film. This was definitely a film that was easy to admire, and I can imagine some people saying easy to admire but hard to love. There were definitely some lulls and there were some flaws that made it less enjoyable that I'll come back to, but from that sort of cold, distant, academic-y kind of standpoint, it's a very easy film to admire and respect. It engages with themes that I don't think many mainstream movies would dare approach. Things like existentialism, things like human self-destruction, things like the meaninglessness of existence and humanity's insignificance. It's very hefty, and it's also quite complex. So I can totally see why someone wouldn't enjoy this film, is what I'm trying to say in a very long-winded way. But I loved it. Well, maybe not. Loved is perhaps an exaggeration. I enjoyed it. Specifically when it got into its more creepy body horror creature feature kind of phase. I think we all know that Alex Garland is a good writer. I think he understands narrative and kind of how to introduce fairly complicated concepts to an audience. He's a very good writer, but this unlike with Ex Machina, I really felt like he could be a great director watching this, because there are images that have seared themselves onto my brain. Things that, again, I have to stress, I haven't seen before, and I don't want to spoil them, but things to do with like the flora and the fauna of this world that he's created that were like, I've honestly I can't think of anything to compare that to. And when he uses that skill set of his for the more horror-oriented moments, I think it works fucking amazingly. This has my favourite scene of the year so far. No question. This scene involving, I won't say too much, involving a bear, that I thought it was one of the most suspenseful, creative, unusual, striking things I've seen in forever. And it was also helpful that it was punctuated by some really awesome violence and gore and icky stuff. And when that stuff is present in this film, I really, really enjoyed it. In between, that was when I felt more like I admired it. It was definitely smart, and in particular, it found a way to do a conclusion that was atypical. It didn't go down a very obvious, predictable route towards the end, and I respected all of that, but there were parts where I found it dragging a little. I will admit that. I'm not ashamed. I'm not going to pretend that I didn't. It's not the pacing, exactly. The pacing is fine. You could make this film with the exact same script, the exact same editing, and the exact same distribution of events. You could have, like, the same pacing, the same amount of stuff happening in the same places, and make a film that would be perfectly entertaining and perfectly accessible. It is not that much slower than things like The Thing or Alien, which are films that I absolutely love. What is a problem is, I don't want to say the acting, but the delivery of the performances, which probably is a roundabout way of saying the acting, but what I'm trying to say is I don't think it's the cast's fault. I know what they were going for, but everyone speaks in this really lethargic, low-energy way. Every scene is like people going, and I know why. The characters are all given a reason to behave in that way. They're given a reason for why they're so wooden, and it's because they all have this emotional baggage. For the plot to happen, they all basically need to have given up on life in various different ways because they're volunteering for this suicide mission. And there's this theme, as I've already mentioned, about self-destruction and people basically enacting their own demise. So they have to basically not give a shit. And I get that, and I get that that's why, for example, Jennifer Jason Leigh's character comes across so low energy and so, like, blah. But at the same time, whilst I understand that that was an intentional direction, an intentional piece of direction, I don't think that it necessarily serves the film, because it makes everything feel like it's taking much longer than it actually is. The pacing isn't that slow, but it feels slow, because you're watching people who don't really look like they give a shit because they don't give a shit. And I just think that they could have perhaps been less understated. They could have maybe emoted a little bit more. I don't think it would negate what they were going for. I don't think that it would be contrary to their feelings of hopelessness. I think that even when people feel like they've given up on life, they can occasionally, emote. And I don't think it was necessary to have every scene in the film be like, so that's my main criticism of this film, was that it felt slower than it actually was because of the low energy performances that I think were intentional, and I realise that. But there is another problem I had, and that was to do with some of the direction. I think that Alex Garland is a very competent director, and he makes some beautifully striking images here, and I think he's got tons of imagination. Tons. But sometimes I thought that the staging and execution wasn't always that great. There's a bit in this film where Natalie Portman's character is shooting at a CGI effect, and I don't know, maybe it's just me, but it looked like the eye line was completely off. Like she was shooting a few feet above where the creature was. And that reminded me a little of something you'd see on the Sci-Fi Channel. Obviously with much higher production value, with much better performances, with much better effects, but it was that kind of shoddiness, that kind of almost amateuriness. I'm sure that there are reasons why, and I might have even been imagining it, but it just felt a little off. And there's another sequence where a creature attacks someone that felt very kind of awkward. Basically, two characters are talking, and then they hear a noise, and then we lead into the sort of Jurassic Park or Alien-style build-up where they're like, something's coming. And then it cut really jarringly to just a wide shot showing the monster attack someone. And it felt like it didn't have the proper build-up. It just sort of was very blunt and matter of, here's the monster, okay. And that, I don't think that was meant in the sort of like Cloverfield-y way, where in Cloverfield the monster just shows up and it's this moment of blind panic and confusion. It just felt like some of the film was missing. Like a couple of shots of build-up were just not there because it was kind of deflating and anticlimactic when it did show up. Other than that, though, I think that this is a film I would recommend to sci-fi fans. It has different ideas. It's not just aliens arriving, and it's not just the kind of tropes you've seen 1,000 times before. It does have fresh ideas, and it actually engages with science, which not much science fiction does. It's talking about cellular mitosis, it's talking about DNA structure and all these different things, and that was interesting, and it made it feel less like a dumb action film disguised as a sci-fi, and more like an actual sci-fi film. It is devoid of big set pieces, of quips, and of all the things that make these films appealing to mass audiences. So I get why it's gone straight to Netflix. I just think it's confusing that it was ever considered for anything else. I think it's got a fantastic conclusion, a really unique way of doing its climax that doesn't feel like anything else I've ever seen before. I think the cinematography was interesting, the way the lighting was refracted, which plays into one of the key themes of the film. There's a shot early on where you're looking at two people holding hands through a glass of water, and the image is kind of distorted from that, and that kind of plays into the themes. I thought it was interesting that they used cinematography to actually not just be style or just to go, here, we'll make things look weird because it's a weird film. They actually use cinematography to kind of enter into a dialogue with the film's themes. That was good. The script was great. It had ambition, it had ideas, it had some really gross moments, it had some really inventive moments. I think that this film is far, far better, or at least far more interesting than Ex Machina. Ex Machina was a simple, effective debut film, and this feels like Alex Garland's gone, now I'm going to make a really, really great film. And I think he did. So, I would recommend this if you like films like I do, but I wouldn't recommend it to everyone. I think if you've listened to what I've been rambling about for the last 16 or so minutes, you'll probably know where you stand.